Welcome to Unlocking Science. Our goal is to glorify God by studying and unlocking the secrets of His amazing creation. I'm your host, Mr. P, and today we've got a special treat. We're going to be looking at some amazing plants that God's created, the Sundews and pitcher plants. And joining me today, I have Mr. Ron Dudek. Now, Ron is someone who comes to the Creation Museum and he presents talks on carnivorous plants and other things that we'll get to learn from him. And he's been studying this for a long time. So how long have you been studying these carnivorous plants?
I started when I was 5 years old. I just turned 60, I hate to admit that, but 55 years I've been playing with these plants and studying them to different degrees, and quite heavily the last 30 years.
All right, so you've got quite an amazing variety in your greenhouse of all kinds of different carnivorous plants from all over the world. And he's going to teach us a little bit about these amazing creations. And we're going to learn about sundews and pitcher plants today. Now, most people, when they think of carnivorous plants, probably think of fly traps because they're the fancy ones that grab things. These are a little more docile. They're not going to reach out and grab you, but they're still very effective in the way they gather extra nutrients and things with the bugs. So why don't you go ahead and jump in and start teaching us.
So we're going to talk about two of the types today, the sticky fly paper and the pitfall plants, or specifically the sundews and the pitcher plants. So sundews, very diverse group of plants, come in a variety of shapes and sizes. You'll find them just about the world over. Only place you really won't find them is on a couple tropical islands and in the Antarctic. And let's take a look here at the ways these plants operate. And if you think of the old Shell No Pest strip you might see hanging in the gas stations, basically it's a coil of tape hanging from the ceiling, and it's very sticky, and we would call that a sticky fly paper. So insects like flies will bump into that, they can't break free, and then they're out of our hair and they're stuck to this fly paper. Well, the sundews work on that principle. So here is the close-up of a leaf of a sundew plant. And you'll see the green leafy part, and it's covered with these little red hair-like tentacles. And you'll notice there's a little red droplet on the top, and actually that droplet's part of the tentacle, and then there's the secretion from it. So real close, that little red spot is a gland that produces that droplet. Now that droplet has a twofold function. One of them is bait. So it's very sweet, and it'll attract small insects that come thinking they're going to get a free meal. Now, as you can see there, my finger's touching it, it's very sticky. And if the insect isn't strong enough to break free, they get glued in place there. And then those droplets release a digestive enzyme that coats the insect very rapidly, penetrates their nite-like suit exoskeleton, gets inside, liquefies the interior, breaks down the proteins and the other nutrients, and the plant can absorb that as food. So just to give you an idea of some of the different shapes and sizes of sundews, there's over 200 species, and they come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. This one is what's called the Pygmy Sundew from Australia, and that's one entire plant. You can see it's smaller than a nickel, so this would feed on very tiny insects. This is a plant from South Africa called Regia, the king sundew. Those sword-like leaves can be up to 2 feet long. So you can imagine this plant as it lays out could be up to 4 feet across. Here's one from Southeast Asia called the Multifidus. Again, this looks like a spider's web, has a very forked sundew shape to it, or forked shape to it, all covered with those sticky droplets. And the one thing they all have in common is they attract and capture in insects to digest them. Now this one is native to the United States. This is called a dew thread. And it grows from Florida up the eastern seaboard, across into Michigan and into Canada. It's a very cold, hardy species. The leaves on that, which look like pipe cleaners, are maybe 6 to 12 inches long on the species that grow up where I live. The Florida or southern species a little bit longer, but you'll notice all those little black specks among those leaves are small flies, gnats, and mosquitoes that were lured to that plant thinking they were going to get a free meal. They got glued in place, and now those droplets have coated their body, broken down into the exoskeleton, and now absorbing the tissues. Now, that particular sundew doesn't move I just showed you. We'll bring that back up. I've got a friend that calls that grass with an attitude. Now, there are other sundews that can move, and these can be the very exciting ones. And this one here is from South Africa. This is called a Cape Sundew. And you'll see a midge, a mosquito-like critter that's caught on there. And the way this particular sundew works, the more that insect struggles to break free, it's bending those tentacles back and forth. And as it does that, there are sense receptors in the leaf that react to that. And the more the insect struggles, they send out electrical messages at the base of those tentacles, which tell the other tentacles, bend towards whatever is moving, and then the entire leaf curls. And here's what that looks like, sped up a few times. See, the worst thing that insect can be doing is struggling to break free.
I've got one of those plants that I sit on my desk. His name is Sylvester.
Been there for quite some time.
He's been growing for about 10 years on my desktop. A very fascinating plant.
Now what's happening in there is those droplets have all been deposited on the insect's body. Insects don't breathe through a nose like we do. They have holes through the sides of their abdomen and thorax called spiracles. That digestive goo plugs that, suffocates the insect, and now the leaf is using hydraulics to squeeze very, very tightly. And what that's doing is it's drawing the nutrients out of the insect, and then the leaf absorbs that, very much like spraying Miracle-Gro fertilizer on your rose bush. Sits like that for several days, up to a week usually, and then it will open again, revealing the digested insect, or basically the exoskeleton. And so here's an idea what that might look like. This is a box elder bug I threw on one of these plants. And you can see it's got a nice plump abdomen there. So if you think of like a Thanksgiving turkey, it's loaded with good nutrients. Well, over the course of several hours, you can see the leaf closing. At the end of 10 hours, that insect is completely engulfed, and the leaf is now using hydraulics to get the nutrients out of that insect. And think of it, that's what you saw before. Once that leaf opens up about a week later, here's what's left. And that is basically the crushed exoskeleton of that box elder bug. So you think people take pictures on Thanksgiving of the turkey on the table. You very seldom take pictures of what's left. And the sundew will leave that there. Very often, that just gets glued in place, and that can be advertising for spiders. Spiders don't realize that digested insect can't be eaten, and they may jump on a plant looking at those exoskeletons, and they could be the next meal. Their 8 legs will stick to those tentacles just as well as the 6 legs of any insect.
So that sweet liquid that's on there actually acts as the attractant to get them in, and the digestive enzymes that draw out that fluid once it's killed the insect.
Oh yeah, has a dual function.
So it's got dual functions. So it's a sneaky little trap that's been laid by the plant there. Mm-hmm.
So let's take a look at a question I have for everyone. What was Charles Darwin's favorite subject? Because he did have a favorite subject. And as you're sitting there at home, you can start pondering, ask people around you, what was Charles Darwin's favorite subject? Because he did have one. And here's what he wrote in a letter to a botanist named Asa Gray. He said, I care more about Drosera than I do the origin of all the species in the world. So the question you want to ask then is, what is Drosera? And that's the geeky scientific name for sundews. See, where Charles Darwin lived in England, there's a species called the roundleaf sundew. We have them here in northern parts of the United States as well. Grows all across northern latitudes. It's a very cold, hardy plant. And Darwin was absolutely fascinated by that plant. And he wrote this in a letter to another botanist. And I could hear him saying this in his British accent. By Jove, I sometimes think Drosera is a disguised animal. And here's why he said that. That's how the roundleaf sundew engulfs a mosquito. If you think of a catcher's mitt closing on a baseball. Now, you and I look at this in the modern day with all our special effects and all the different crazy movies we've seen, we think, cool. You go back into the minds of the Victorian era scientists like Charles Darwin, that's pure science fiction. That was a mind blower. And most folks do not realize the fact that Darwin wrote other books other than The Origin of Species. That one came out in 1859. He wrote another book that came out in 1875 called The Insectivorous Plants. And believe it or not, this particular book is actually really good. I give it a thumbs up. And here's why. In that other book on the origin of species, he gave his ideas on how one type of organism over long periods of time could morph and change into radically new types of organisms. See, his presuppositions or starting point were incorrect, that there is no God and there's only natural processes. So his end conclusion in that book was wrong, that things evolve by chance. This particular book really doesn't get into the idea of where these plants came from. He was out to prove that they were carnivorous because in his day, that was hotly debated. The book contains numerous drawings. They didn't have digital photography back then. And here you'll see some sundew drawings. These were done by his two sons, Francis and George. They're absolutely gorgeous drawings. So, time to impress your friends. If they can't figure out what Charles Darwin's favorite subject was, these are the correct answers. You could say carnivorous plants. If you want to be more specific, it was the sundews that was his favorite. If you want to be a little bit nerdy, the scientific name for sundews is Drosera, and if you're a total geek, the specific species, that little round leaf species, is Drosera rotundifolia, which means the round leaf sundew. That was Charles Darwin's favorite subject right there. Again, I gave that a hot thumbs up. Now, in his day, here's what the Christians were saying. This is why Darwin gets credited with some good science. That particular book, what he did, he's putting pieces of egg, meat, milk on the sundew, and he's watching the reaction. And he was documenting that the plant was actually drawing nutrients from it. Now, this is a quote from Carolus Linnaeus, where we get our modern classification from. And it was apparently Linnaeus' opinion that this could not be the case. These plants could not be carnivorous because that would be against the order of nature as willed by God. So Darwin, believe it or not, in that book basically proved this incorrect. And he is the scientist that gets the credit for proving these plants are carnivorous. It's good observational science.
So if we think about Linnaeus' quote there, his statement was something he said about Scripture, but nowhere in Scripture do we see a statement that says plants do not eat insects. There's no direct statement like that. He was inferring some of those things. Yeah. So Linnaeus made a wrong conclusion about Scripture, and Darwin used observational science to demonstrate these things. So when science and the Bible come into this apparent conflict, we have to be careful with the way we look at those things. But if there's no clear statement in Scripture that denies that truth, then there's no reason that this couldn't be the case.
Right. We need to hold to Scripture tightly, but our models loosely.
Absolutely.
And that was a model that needed to be discarded right there, because we'll get into that. Why we have carnivorous plants, because I don't believe God ever intended it to be that way.
No, that's not the way from the beginning. Sure.
So let's move on a little bit. We're going to go to our pitfall plants. Before we do that, though, let's get us some close-ups. I brought some sundews. The sundew in the very front, right there, that happens to be that one that I called grass with an attitude. And you'll notice this one has caught a fly. Now, in Michigan, we had our first warm day yesterday. So normally, this pot would be overflowing with these plants, and it would be literally covered with insects. And then on the other side, there's a little shorter version. That's a hybrid, which is actually a hybrid between this taller one and a type of plant that you saw that was eating that mosquito from the Darwin clip. This one actually a little shorter, and it can curl on insects. But you can notice how they glisten in that light.
And that's where we get the name sundew. It looks like there's dew covering the surface of them, but it's actually those sticky little droplets. So if I were to bring in my finger here and touch one of those, it'll actually stick to my finger. You can see the plant bending and maybe even the little string stretching out from there. So that would grab that insect and bond them to that leaf.
If you're not big enough to break free, you're stuck there, and this plant is going to start right there. It was starting to do a little chemistry analysis of Roger Patterson. And I have one other sundew from South Africa. This is called a Venusta.
And that one's got some beautiful red colors in it, and I think we can probably see the sparkling drops. The drops on that one probably get a little bit larger than the other.
I'm going to flip this around, and The other day, this grows in my house during the winter time, and you'll see on that particular leaf, there was a fly that got caught.
So it's curled around.
And squeezing it right now to get the nutrients out.
Extracting all the nutrients out of that. That's what Sylvester does sitting on my desk. If there's a fruit fly wandering around the office, they'll land on there and get trapped.
Yeah, very prolific, easy to grow. This is a tropical. We have Rogers growing on his desk with a 100-watt LED equivalent light bulb set at about 15 to 16 hours right over it, and grows quite well. But those are our sticky flypapers, or the sundew plants. So let's move to the next plant, our pitfall traps. And these are, by the way, if you want to talk about a plant that is a glutton, these are the gluttons of the carnivorous plant world. So if we pan back here, think of it like this: digging a hole in the ground and just letting things fall in. That's why we're going to classify this as a pitfall trap. Probably the simpler design, but the more effective insect catcher due to its size and some of the design features, and we'll move into that. So just to give you an idea, this is the front of one of these trumpet pitcher plants. Now, there are several species that occur from about eastern Texas through the Florida Panhandle and up the eastern seaboard into about Virginia is about where they'll end with this type, the trumpet type. And depending on whose book you read, there could be anywhere from 6 to 13 of these species. I'm not going to debate that point. We're going to just talk about the design. But there you'll see, there's the opening, and there's a lid over it. Now, these can grow anywhere from several inches to almost 4 feet tall. There's also a lid over that opening. Being a tall trumpet-like structure, if it were to fill with rainwater, it would topple over very easily. And what that lid does, it helps to keep rainwater out, but like our sundew, we have an attractant. There are nectar glands all around the edge of that lid. And that nectar not only glistens, but it gives off a sweet odor, and it'll attract flying insects like flies to come in for a meal. Also, that's the opening, and we're looking toward the base. There are nectar glands that occur at the base of the trumpet all the way up to the opening, and there's more nectar glands below that lid. But look where you see the most nectar glistening. So whether you fly in and crawl down or walk in and crawl up, you're being led to that all-you-can-eat nectar buffet inside the opening. And now the plant has a few tricks up its sleeve. On some of these plants, that nectar is laced with a narcotic that drugs insects sometimes within seconds. Also, if we look at the cells that line that area under a microscope, they resemble little shark's teeth, overlap like roof shingles. And insects have a clasping foot pad that can't get a grip on that. They slip. Also, on some of the plants, there are these little downward pointing spike-like hairs pointing toward the opening. So what the plant is doing here is basically saying, come on in for a free meal of narcotic-laced nectar on an extraordinarily slippery surface while I poke at your heels. And the idea, it wants that insect inside the plant. So this next clip I'm going to show you here, to show you how powerful that nectar is. I gave that fly a 3-second whiff of that nectar, and it went right off my fingers into the pitcher. It's feeding, and it goes right in. Let's see that again. Watch this. 1, 2, 3. Typically, that fly would run for its life after you've grabbed it with your fingers. And you can see the feet slipping on that surface, and then down it goes. This particular species grows in eastern Texas. Sarracenia is the genus Alata. I say in the summer months when it gets hot, this is the real assassin of these plants. Because on a hot summer day, sometimes you can watch 5 and 6 insects every couple of minutes falling inside the plant until they actually fill it up.
So this would grab things even as large as hornets and wasps and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Not just small flies.
So here is one of these pitcher tubes. Let's see how well this comes in. And you see hornets there at the base. Now watch this. It can't crawl on that slippery surface, but it's got wings. Now watch how it's going to, look at this. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. I'm almost there. Look, I'm at the top, and down it goes again. Now that can happen for hours on end. What just happened there? Why couldn't it get out? Well, it has to do with something with the airflow that would take place inside of a tube. So think of it like this. Our insect has fallen inside, and in order to go up, it starts beating its wings, which sends a jet of air down. That's going to give it lift. But the moment it starts creating that blast of air to get lift, that automatically sucks air in from the top, and the airflow will look like this. And that's what you just saw. The harder that insect tried to fly out, the more of its own energy it used against itself. And it basically wore itself out. And that can go on for several hours. And these plants love growing in bright, sunny areas. So the tubes get very hot. And so here are some hornets that same day. Look at this. This is in the evening. You don't see the same vigor. They have exhausted themselves from trying to fly out. It's very hot in there. The oxygen levels are dropping. And typically, what has been caught during the day is usually dead by nightfall. They just don't have that same zeal to get out of there. And what the pitcher tube will do is, as the tube fills with insects, it produces digestive enzymes that fill from the bottom to meet them, to break down their tissues. If you were to do an autopsy on one of these plants, let's say in late fall, that's the contents of a pitcher plant's stomach right there. And what you see is, well, you can see maybe the back end of a hornet over there and a lot of other broken down parts. And the nutrients have been absorbed into the leaf tissue, sent down into the root system to help make little pitcher plants for the following year. I mentioned this in the fly trap talk. The reason why they need these insects, the soil is very low in nutrients where they grow, very low in nitrogen, potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus. And they're obtaining those nutrients from the bodies of the insects that they capture there. Typically, with the trumpet pitcher plants, as you get into the late fall and winter time, they just deteriorate. So they will break down and fall all over the place and dissolve, and you get new pitchers the following year. If you want to step over here, we've got a sample. And you can see here's the tube, and there's that opening. And again, the lid, which will have the nectar droplets around the edge. By the way, this happens to be a flower right here, which has not opened yet. And this is not a real large specimen. Again, we're early in the season. There'll be some taller ones later. These are the first ones to open in my greenhouse. These can, almost triple in size. This is called the Sarracenia aureophila, this particular plant. So you give you an idea of the shape and size of the plant. But you can see why they would call it a trumpet. If you were to snap it off here at the base, it would look like one of those trumpets you had at a Roman gladiator game.
Now you can probably see the little red veins moving down through the side of the plant there. It would be fascinating to me to try and take a picture of those under different light conditions, like especially UV light. Because we know that a lot of insects see in UV, and a lot of flowers kind of function like a beacon. So if you took a picture of a flower in UV light, it's like this big bullseye in the middle of the flower that says, "Come here to get your nectar." I wonder if that would be the case here. Something we could
I think
check
it
out
would
in the
be.
future.
And by the way, this is a very tame colored plant. These red veins will get a lot redder through the summer. But here's a hybrid. And there are several species that hybridize very beautifully. There's what's called the white top pitcher plant. And then the purple pitcher plant, I'll show you in a moment. You can hybridize them, and these colors can be quite stunning.
Okay, you've used that word a couple times today, so that's our big science word of the day, hybridize. So when we say something can hybridize, that means one species can interbreed with another. And that would mean that those are part of the same created kind. So from a biblical perspective, we use hybridization to help us understand what those created kinds were that God originally created at the beginning. Now, we would not likely get one of these pitcher plants to hybridize with a fly trap
Will not happen.
with a sundew, even though that we classify them as carnivorous plants. That's not going to happen. So that would indicate those are different created kinds. And from a biblical perspective, that's how we understand God created those things from the beginning.
Excellent. By the way, I didn't talk about these today, but I did bring one. Believe it or not, this and this are of the same created kind. They're both In other words, you can take a plant like that one, all right, and hybridize it with this one to get something along this line. What makes this most fascinating is this one traps its prey by air suction, whereas this one, the lid is open to the atmosphere and it collects rainwater and it drowns its prey in the rainwater.
But because of the structure, it's got that big bulbous space. It's not going to tip over if it gets filled up like the trumpet style.
And they grow in, these will tend to grow in the very swamp, the very more water-laced areas than the trumpets you might find. But again, this just goes to show you the variation within a kind.
Yes.
There's a lot of variation within this particular kind.
Now you mentioned the flower over here that hadn't opened up yet,
Wow.
but right here we have one that has.
This is the flower of another hybrid, and Sarracenia flowers are quite beautiful. This is the only one I've got so far. I normally have hundreds of them. This was the first one, so I quick snipped it off. I hopefully will have more in the next several weeks with the warm weather coming. Interestingly, some of these flowers can smell quite sweet, and others smell just like cat urine.
Yeah.
And the term is feline. This one has a mixture.
A mixture of those, so it's got kind of a musky, sweet smell. Now you've got another type here that's not a Sarracenia. This one functions a little differently. Instead of having the pitchers growing straight up, the pitchers on this one come off of the end of the leaves.
Now this one has gotten a lot of publicity in recent years. Whereas the trumpet pitchers are an American plant, this grows in Southeast Asia. This is called a Nepenthes. And you'll find these growing. Sometimes they'll root themselves in the branches of trees in the leaf litter or down the sides of little rocky cliffs. Just to give you an idea, I bought this at Lowe's 2 years ago. You can buy them sometimes on the get rid of rack for $1. What makes this one so fascinating, this is a small pitcher. There are species of this plant that grow large enough to capture birds, rats, and other large mammals. Rats.
Yeah. Even things like small monkeys, young monkeys.
If they're small enough to, and imagine a pitcher like this that's the size of a basketball. Similar idea. You have a slippery rim. Some of these plants will be laced with a narcotic. Very sweet. Primarily they're going to go after ants. They're going to fill this up, but every so often you do get a nosy, tree shrew or something that gets on here, and they can fall inside and get trapped.
All right, one last special plant we're going to show very carefully. Now this is a plant that you've worked with for many years and done some amazing things with to show how adaptable these plants are to their environments.
Yeah, this is Nepenthe Stomata, which some people would say is the most sought after carnivorous plant in the world. And this grows on the island of Sulawesi. And the reason why people want this one so badly is if you look inside, it almost looks like it has teeth.
So there are those little hooked teeth that line the rim around the pitcher area.
And
there.
they will produce a little nectar droplet, again, mostly to attract small insects that go in there, fall in and then drown and be digested by the plant. But again, if something a little larger puts its head in there, it's not going to be able to pull itself backwards. And the reason I've gotten a little bit of notoriety with this is it was claimed that this was a plant that could not be hybridized to house growing, and it took me several years, but I've hybridized this plant. I would say hybrid. How would I say acclimated?
Acclimated.
I have acclimated this to growing basically in my fireplace room, and I've done that now since 2007, and sold quite a few cuttings. So this is one of the babies I have left over. I have a mother plant that fills an entire window box.
Yeah.
But again, this just reminds you, cursed is the ground for your sake, or for thy sake, when Adam sinned, thorns and thistles it shall produce. I see thorn-like structures when I look in there. And again, God created plants to be food for animals. And here's a plant that has turned the tables.
Yes. So we often talk about these in New Title Your Talks, cursed plants, because from the beginning of creation, God had created everything perfectly. Everything was in a state of perfect balance, and everything that the animals needed were provided for the plants, and vice versa. So we think that these designs that we see apparent now were not part of the original creation, but something that God has allowed to develop in these organisms over time after the curse as a result of those things to be able to survive. Now, these pitcher plants would be able to survive if they never caught an insect, but they wouldn't thrive in the soils that they do. And so God provides for these things in that way. All right, that's a little bit about pitcher plants and sundews. We hope we've kind of piqued your interest and you'll get out and explore some of those things, do some more research, maybe pick up one of these plants. We'll be doing some other episodes looking at how all of these things can be grown and repotted. And until we see you next time, get out and explore God's amazing creation.